So I think that we're at a critical moment in time. In the last few decades, globalization and short-term focused financial markets have applied heavy pressure on businesses to cut costs. And this has led to a breakdown in the social contract between businesses and workers. The idea that businesses should be providing workers with rising pay, career pathways, benefits, and training is increasingly the exception rather than the norm. And this means that workers are uniquely vulnerable to future waves of automation disruption. So now, what could disruption look like? The most salient effect of automation is the replacement of human labor with machine labor, the substitution effect, causing the composition of jobs in the economy to change as some jobs are eliminated and others are created, which you've probably heard 6 or 7 times today already. Many manual and routine jobs, such as cashiers, warehouse stockers, will disappear or at least shrink. These jobs are oftentimes entry-level, and while they rarely provide a living wage, they're certainly available to just about anyone that wants to work hard. In addition, artificial intelligence is becoming more sophisticated and widespread. The number of as the slide shows, the number of startups developing AI systems is growing exponentially, and the share of jobs that require AI skills, while still at a relatively low level, is increasing by a factor of 5 since 2015. And what the implication of this is that this can affect many routine cognitive jobs, such as accounting and legal jobs, and can find a lot of those jobs also to be automated, and many of those jobs are middle skill. Now, that is more the displacement effect, but there is a second effect, which is less salient, but I think far more widespread, which is a complementary effect, where technology is increasingly incorporated into the workplace, causing the composition of job responsibilities within each job to change. The job will remain, but it will require different skills. So overall, as the McKinsey report has shown, about 23% of current work activity hours in the U.S. could be automated by 2030, and then about 60% of occupations, at least 1/3 of the constituent activities could be automated. And up to about 1/3 of workers may need to be transitioning entirely into different occupations by 2030. So now what does this mean for workers? It's true that some jobs of the future will require more education. Others may actually require less education. The challenge is not necessarily how do we get workers more education or training, but rather the problem is that we need workers to be constantly acquiring skills over the course of their careers. So what we need is a system of workforce development for the 21st century that provides training for workers that is quality, affordable, and skills-based. So what system do we have in the US, I should add? 3 components: 1, traditional education; another, business investment; and the third is government investment. And the US relies fairly heavily on those first 2 components. They account for about 85% of total education, post-secondary education and training. And I think one thing that is unique is, in particular, the reliance on business training. I'll get to that in a second. So the first is the traditional education. A rising share of college graduates are entering now low-skill and low-wage jobs, like clerical and service occupations, that should not, in theory, require a college education. This is something that was talked about in an earlier panel about kind of degree inflation. This can happen both when employers are trying to filter out a variety of different, from a large swath of applications by saying, well, we need a college degree, even when the job itself may not actually require that. Or maybe the employers are not actually requiring a college degree, but nonetheless, there are a lot of college graduates who are still applying for and getting those jobs anyway. So what we are seeing more generally is that the stereotype of the college graduate working in a more low-skill job like retail that does not necessarily require a bachelor's degree, that's actually also borne out by the data. And in fact, entry-level hourly wages fell by over 5%, both for men and women, for recent college grads between 2000 and 2013. So there's more and more recent college grads that are getting into jobs that may not require a degree, and they tend to be low-wage jobs, and overall wages for recent college grads are falling. This suggests to me that it is questionable whether the traditional college degree can really provide most of the answer for the challenges that we are facing, that workers are going to be facing going forward. That does not mean that higher education institutions cannot provide the answer. They absolutely can. And I think that we've heard a lot of panelists talk about kind of all the different ways that higher education institutions can be moving towards offering a lot of short-term credentials that are much more skills-based, but that getting everyone into kind of just a bachelor's degree is not, may not necessarily be the answer to kind of transitioning to a more of a lifelong learning system. The second leg of the stool is business investment in workers, and this is something that the United States relies very heavily on. This is actually something that you see not just with worker training, but also with benefits provisions too. You look at the healthcare system in the U.S. It has historically been workers and individuals get their healthcare from their employer. They get also oftentimes training from their employer as well. We design a lot of different systems around the firm rather than around the worker themselves. Unfortunately, based on the data available, employers have been investing less in worker training. From 1996 to 2008, the percentage of workers receiving employer-sponsored training fell by 42%, and on-the-job training fell by 36%. Employer-provided tuition assistance has also been falling in recent years, from 66% of surveyed businesses offering tuition assistance in 2008 to 53% in 2017. In addition, the investment that businesses are making in workers tends to be heavily skewed towards workers that already have higher education. So about 2/3 of the employed labor market in the U.S. Does not have a college degree, yet they are only receiving about 42% of the investments made by businesses. So both businesses are investing less, and on top of that, they are skewed in a direction that is targeted away from the workers that need it the most, the workers that are the most vulnerable. The final leg is also government investment, and this is also falling. So between 1985 and 2016, U.S. government spending on workforce training programs fell as a percent of GDP from 0.14% to 0.03%. And that leaves us now, thanks to our friends in the OECD for this data, this leaves us now with spending on workforce training programs as a share of the economy is now at an international lows, less than a quarter of the OECD average. So what's happening? So college is good, but may not necessarily be the silver bullet. It doesn't appear that it is, as currently constructed, working for everybody. Business training may be effective, but businesses are disinvesting, and government is also disinvesting from the workforce. So what do we need? We need a 21st century training system that is focused on teaching in-demand skills, that encourages lifelong learning, not just for dislocated workers, but for all workers, even those that are employed and that are trying to stay ahead of the curve, that provides an alternative for college, and incorporates, but is not dependent on employers. So at the Aspen Future of Work Initiative, we've focused on two main policy approaches to tackle this problem. And I know that's a lot of text. The first approach is to encourage businesses to invest. And so we've been pushing a variety of different policies, designing and advocating for policies. And we work a lot both with members of Congress and also with state legislators and governors at the state level. The first is the worker training tax credit. The idea is that similar to, so the U.S. has a tax credit called the R&D tax credit that incentivizes the investment in knowledge capital and in innovation. The idea is to do a similar thing for human capital. So this could either be done on the federal level or the state level, is establish a tax credit that could be used by businesses to offset some of the cost of investing in their workers. And we are cognizant of the fact that a lot of businesses already invest in their workers, right? So you don't want to just establish a tax credit that subsidizes the training that's already happening. So similar to the U.S. Research and Development tax credit, what this tax credit would be designed to do is it has kind of a look-back period, and for each firm, they get subsidized only on the increase in their training above the past few years that they've been training. So so they do not get subsidized necessarily for the training they're already doing. And this has already been relatively successful, as I said, with the R&D tax credit. The second piece is on accounting. What we find is that the way that corporate accounting treats human capital investment is as an expense, not as an investment. So what that means is that shows up simply as a one-year expense. It shows up as overhead. So if you are an investor and you are trying to you want to invest in a company that invests in their workers, you have a difficult time doing that because you're going to see two different companies, one of whom may have high overhead and one of whom may be investing in their workers, and you can't tell which is which. Both of them, from the accounting disclosure the financial disclosure forms, they will look the same. Both of them will look like they just are spending a lot of money, as opposed to investing in their future. Also, of course, if you're a worker too, you want to know which businesses are actually investing in their workforce. And again, there's no standardized way to that businesses report out this information. And if they do report it out, it's not necessarily verified. Another reason, of course, is as we know, there's increased pressure on companies over the last few decades to really be investing in, or really to be maximizing short-run profits to maximize shareholder value. And the one way that they can do that is because human capital investments and worker training are seen as expenses rather than investments, then you can simply cut those expenses and boost profits. If those investments were able to be spread out over a longer period of time, the length of the investment, the value of the investment would be providing, then that incentive to cut workforce training in order to boost profits would be diminished. The final policy here is also then worker representation. The idea is that businesses, again, have moved away from kind of this model that they had a few decades ago of more kind of a multi-stakeholder model. So where corporate governance used to be something that was a balancing of a variety of different stakeholders, the workers being kind of one of the main ones, that there has been a shift towards focusing just on maximizing shareholder value and seeing workers more as costs to be cut rather than things to be invested in. And so the idea is that there should be a certain amount of members of the corporate board that are elected by the workers. This is what similar thing to what Germany does in their co-determination model, and this has also been this is something that's been in the news recently. Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts recently proposed this. It's something that we proposed actually a year and a half ago, but we didn't make it up, so we can't take too much credit. But we do believe that it's something that can have a lot of traction across the political spectrum. On top of that, we are also working in the second bucket to helping workers get training outside of their employment situation through a couple different ways. One is through lifelong learning and training accounts. This is something that I think Max mentioned in his presentation. And we've put up we've proposed a policy that would do just this. The idea is that you're creating accounts that workers can save for then potential future training costs. Here, we believe it's really important that it's not just workers, but also employers and government that are all co-investing. And I should have a brief divergence. There are a couple proposals out there on lifelong learning accounts that largely rely on a tax preference, in particular on workers contributing and it being pre-tax income. That is similar to how we have 401ks and you do a lot of different retirement and also health savings accounts in the US. All of these it's a policy mechanism that subsidizes these accounts, but does so in a way that really benefits middle and higher income workers. And we don't think that that is the best way that the government should be subsidizing these accounts. So the direction that we have taken, in contrast to a lot of the other approaches, is that this is a match. So if the worker puts in some money, then the government will also put money directly into the account. On top of that, we have a lower match as incomes rise. So we're really targeting the workers that need it the most. On top of that, there is a bill currently in Congress, the Jobs Act. Is a bipartisan bill that was attached to a higher ed reauthorization that ended up not going into law for a variety of other reasons, in part because Washington doesn't work anymore. But this is a relatively non-controversial amendment. I would expand Pell Grants. So Pell Grants is one of the main means-tested programs to help lower-income Americans afford college. To expand Pell eligibility to cover a high-quality and rigorous short-term training programs as well. So to expand it beyond just kind of traditional college degrees. And the final is income share agreements. This idea is that students receive education funding in exchange for an agreed-upon percentage of post-graduation income over a defined number of years. And this is something that you can think of it similar to, a student loan is debt. This is essentially equity. So this is does not necessarily need to be government, can be an educational institution. Purdue University in Indiana is actually doing this already. They've got about 500 contracts that are currently active and have already worth about $6 million. What they do is basically they've currently been covering about $10,000 for eligible students. And then over the course of the next 8 years, that student pays back 3.38. This is just specifically for an economics student. They have different terms for different types of students. But that student then pays back 3.38% of their income over the next 8 years. If they're making under $20,000, they pay nothing. So this is a much more progressive way to help students pay for college, because the risk goes to the university rather than to the individual themselves. I mentioned this in the policy bucket because there's some bills that currently need to create a regulatory structure for this type of contract that currently doesn't exist, in particular to make sure that there are consumer protections. Given that this is a somewhat new type of financial contract, it's really important that there are strong consumer protections there. The final thing I'll say is just that, in particular in the second bucket, in trying to develop the workforce training system to be more worker-centric as opposed to just business-centric, I do think that we need to be careful not to shift the responsibility of training to the worker. There's already been a broader trend of risk shifting that has gone from socialized risk to individualized risk, and we do not want to be necessarily reinforcing that. So I think it's really important then to also be focusing on expanding the workforce infrastructure system. There's mention earlier about one-stop shops. Those are things that they do exist in the U.S., but they are also massively underfunded. Funding for state grants for those has gone down by 40% in the last 15 years. So it's very important, if we are going to have a system that is more worker-focused, also to make sure that workers have access to career counseling and understand the career pathways that are available to them. Thank you.